Good morning. I'm Kimberly Charrington, and I would like to welcome each of you on behalf of the National Institute for Deterrence Studies, otherwise known as NIDS, for tuning in to today's Huessy Seminar, where the most important interaction is with you. NIDS is a 501c3 nonprofit organization that provides deterrence education by hosting live and virtual events, podcasts, publications on global security, as well as workshops and courses through our NIDS Academy, all in the interest of advancing peace and promoting stability through a strong national security and nuclear deterrent. You can see more of what we have to offer and get involved at thinkdeterrence.com. Please help us grow our membership and audiences by following us on LinkedIn, on X, Rumble, and YouTube, as well as wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Our next virtual Huessy seminar will be held on May 9th. We'll host Dr. Jim Howe as he talks about the China-Russia strategic and theater nuclear weapons, its 2044 forecast and potential U.S. response. On May 23rd, we have Dr. Carver, who will speak on strategic shifts with Russia's tactical nukes. On June 6th, deterring the new pacing threats of opportunistic and coordinated aggression with Matt Koslow, a senior analyst at the National Institute for Public Policy. And on June 13th, we have Lieutenant General In-bom Chun, who will be sharing his perspective on the implications of nuclear-armed South Korea. We have 3 live events coming up at Capitol Hill Club in Washington, D.C. If you're in town and can make it. May 16th, we have breakfast with Lieutenant General Andrew Gabara on the role of Sentinel and the B-21. On June 3rd, ICBMs and bombers, a status update on 2/3 of this nuclear triad with General Lutton, Deputy Commander at U.S. Air Force Global Strike Command, and Uzi Rubin live on June 27th, addressing the growing concerns of missile threats in the Middle East. You can look for an invitation to all of these events in your inbox or go to thinkdeterrence.com to our events page to register. You may also email me or to get your colleagues on that guest list for our future events, and they will receive an invitation as well. Today, during our presentation, we encourage you to write your questions in the chat box at any time. When we begin the Q&A portion of this presentation, one of us will read the question you submitted. However, if you don't get your question answered, we'll be sure to send it to the speakers afterwards, and they have the opportunity to separately message you. Or you can email us afterwards at nids@thinkdeterrence.com, and we will pass it along. If you like a question or think a question's important in the chat box, feel free to give it a thumbs up, and we will make sure that that question is given priority. I want to introduce our host for today's Huessy seminar, Mr. Peter Huessy, President and Senior Director for Strategic Deterrence Studies at Geostrategic Analysis and a Senior Fellow here at NIDS. Peter?
Thank you very much, Kimberly, and I want to thank our guests who are here today, particularly our supporters and sponsors. Without their help, we would not be able to do this series. We're really honored today to have Robert Peters. He is a Senior Research Fellow for Strategic Deterrence at the Heritage Foundation. Prior to that, he led a research team of 42 people at DTRA, the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, and put together their 5-year strategy. And prior to that, he was with the National Defense University at the WMD Center for a number of years. And prior to that, he was in the Office of the Secretary of Defense, where he helped put together the Nuclear Posture Review, the New START Treaty, and the Quadrennial Defense Review. We're honored to have Robert with us today. He's a prolific writer, and you can go to the Heritage Foundation and see a great deal of what he's done. But Robert, again, it's an honor for us to have you here, and take it away.
Great, thanks, Peter. Yeah, it's great to be here. This is a great series, and I think what you all are doing is so important. So thanks for doing what you do with this series. My focus right now is on trying to understand what the Russians and Chinese are doing from their perspective, and then what do we need to do, not as a reaction, but what do we need do. It's in our best national interest. And my current view is that Russia and China are not only modernizing their strategic deterrence, but they're actually building and fielding theater nuclear warfighting capabilities. And so you can kind of look across the board and try to understand what they're doing and what the implications are for the United States and its allies. And so, starting with Russia, um, according to open sources, Russia has upwards of around 2,000 non-strategic nuclear weapons in their Western military district. You couple that with their near monthly threats of nuclear employment on the West against NATO allies, against Ukraine, against the United States. And what you see is a diversity of a non-strategic arsenal on a variety of land attack systems, anti-ship capabilities, sea launch capabilities, air launch capabilities, systems that have both ballistic and non-ballistic trajectories. And this looks all for all the world like a nuclear warfighting arsenal. On par with the types of capabilities that we fielded in the Cold War. And we have attempted for a long, long time to get the Russians to engage in arms control for non-strategic weapons, and they've simply refused. And now they refuse to engage in any kind of discussions on post-New START treaties. And so when you look at that, you look at this as a country that's led by a dictator that has strategic parity with the United States, regularly engages or attempts to engage in nuclear coercion, and fields an arsenal that includes nuclear warfighting capabilities. Then you look on the other side of the planet and you see China that's in the midst of, as Admiral Chaz Richard has described, a breathtaking nuclear breakout. And we've all seen the images of the new ICBM silos in the Western Desert. We've seen the assessments from the China Military Power Report that says they're the fastest growing nuclear power on the planet, and that they're adding about 100, 105 new nuclear warheads every year to their arsenal. That's all bad, but you also look at how they're fielding dual capable DF-21s, DF-26s, potentially DF-27s that can carry conventional or low yield nuclear warheads. And then they co-locate these launchers at the battalion level. And when we try to engage with the Chinese and ask them why they're doing these things, there's no response. Or the response is, the equivalent of get lost or kick rocks. And so you've got a China that's building as many nuclear weapons as they can. And there's a lot of evidence that suggests that they're using every gram of plutonium they have every year to build these weapons. And so that means if they had more plutonium, would they build more nuclear weapons per year? Very probably. And so you've got a China that is the fastest growing nuclear power on the planet. They now have quantitatively the largest Navy in the world. We've got the largest concentration of ballistic missiles and cruise missiles opposite Taiwan. And they're building fifth generation fighters that I think in a couple of years will surpass the American inventory for fifth generation fighters. So you look at this as, okay, they're also building a nuclear warfighting arsenal. And they're doing this in the absence of any nuclear weapons that are within their theater. I think we all remember that the last American non-strategic nuclear weapon was removed from the Korean Peninsula in 1991 as part of President Bush's PNI's, presidential nuclear initiatives. And so they're doing this breathtaking nuclear expansion in the absence of any American theater nuclear capabilities. And so you have to say the two authoritarians in Beijing and Moscow are fielding not only arsenals that are optimized to deter strategic attack on homeland, but can engage in limited theater range, low yield or variable yield nuclear warfighting. And that is deeply concerning. And so for me, what we need to do is we need to do kind of three things at the nuclear side, and then a missile defense. The first thing is I think we need to prepare to upload the strategic arsenal. That should begin, 15 minutes after New START expires in February of 2026. And by that, I mean we need to put additional warheads on the Minuteman force and prepare to reopen shuttered ballistic missile tubes on the Ohio fleet that were shuttered to comply with New START. And I think that the right number gets you to around 2,200 warheads in my mind, over a period that stretches from February 2026 to about 12 months thereafter. And then on the non-strategic side, I think that there's some things that we should be doing in the immediate term and then in the longer term to try to, in my mind, stop the hemorrhaging. So I do think there's a deterrence gap because our adversaries are fielding these nuclear theater range, nuclear warfighting capabilities. And so what we should be doing in the immediate term is taking a small number of W-80s out of the ready reserve stockpile and putting them on some JASSM-ERs, some TLAMs, and some LRASMs, and then forward deploying those capabilities into both the Western Pacific and the European theaters, and call it good enough. And call it good enough until we can actually build new warheads that are fit to purpose to deter theater aggression. I would also be looking at the non-strategic side is reintroducing American gravity bombs into Osan and Kunsan, having that conversation with our allies in Seoul, and then having similar conversations with our allies in Helsinki and Warsaw to do something similar over there. I think we need to get those three states in particular on a glide path to get into a NATO-style DCA, dual capable aircraft sharing arrangement, in which you have, say, Polish pilots that are flying Polish aircraft that can employ American nuclear weapons once you're in a acute crisis or conflict, and then they've got the release authority from SACEUR. But our bases, because of the NATO-Russia Founding Act, we can't have forward station nuclear weapons into the newer members of NATO. We can't have permanent deployments of American forces in the newer newer NATO states. And I think it's time we put the NATO-Russia Founding Act into the graveyard and just accept that it's a dead letter and that we need to do what we need to do to deter adversary aggression. And I also think that the borders have moved roughly 1,100 nautical miles to the east since the fall of the Berlin Wall. And I'm not sure having DCA bases in Western Europe are as credible in 2025 as they were in 1985. And so for flight times alone and the need to do aerial refueling, I think you kind of have to put a limited number, say 25 B-61s and 25 B-61s into Poland and Finland, respectively. And I think it's a similar story in South Korea. And so those are things that you can do in the immediate to near to medium term once you have those political discussions with those states' capitals themselves, and then also with the NAC when you're talking about Poland and Finland. But longer term, we need to build a non-strategic arsenal that's significantly larger than what we have today. So if you posit that we have, somewhere in the ballpark of a couple hundred, maybe a bit more, maybe a bit less, non-strategic nuclear weapons in the U.S. arsenal, because we largely got rid of those things at the end of the Cold War and the decades that came thereafter. I think we need to go up to around 2,000 operationally deployed non-strategic nuclear weapons. And why 2,000? You need to put some in Eastern Europe, you need to put some in the Western Pacific, and you need to have various characteristics. You need some that are penetrating, you need some that are standoff. You need some that have a ballistic trajectory, some that are a non-ballistic trajectory. You need some that can have visible generation characteristics, some that you can generate non-visibly. I think it's time for the Army to get back in the nuclear business. I think it's time that we look seriously at ground launch cruise missiles and ground launch ballistic missiles. Greg Weaver's done some really good work on this topic recently through the Atlantic Council. I recommend that study to everyone. But I think we need a similar variety of both maritime platforms and air platforms at the same time. And I really would like to have Dark Eagle N or long range hypersonic weapon N as well. I think having a nuclear capable hypersonic option could be desirable in certain circumstances as well. So those are the three. Oh, I'm sorry, those are two buckets. And the third bucket for on the nuclear side gets to we have to reset the nuclear enterprise. And I've been pretty vocal about this. But I think that NNSA is damn near in mission failure. And so why do I say that? The primary mission of NNSA is to ensure that we have a credible nuclear arsenal, which includes producing fully constituted nuclear weapons. And we are now in year 15 of the 2010 nuclear modernization program of record, and we have yet to build a single fully constituted new nuclear warhead. B-6113, it's great, but it doesn't count. I mean, that's an old weapon that's been somewhat modernized. And we've only built one single diamond stamp plutonium pit. And you compare that with where we were in the Cold War, in which we broke ground at Rocky Flats in 1951, and 18 months later, Rocky Flats churned out its first plutonium pit. And 9 years after that, the United States was building 6,000 new fully constituted nuclear warheads per year. So there were problems with Rocky Flats, right? In which there was some real pollution with plutonium, and there's a reason why Rocky Flats doesn't exist today as anything other than a wildlife sanctuary. So I don't want to go back there. I don't want to go back. If Rocky Flats was here, if you're cranking out lots of warheads and weapons at an industrial scale, but doing some not insignificant environmental damage at the same time, we're over here, in which there's no environmental damage, but we're not cranking out warheads, we're not cranking out plutonium pits, and we're watching our adversaries put more emphasis on nuclear weapons and increasingly engaging in nuclear coercion. And so this is not a good place. This ain't a good place. We need to get somewhere in between. Maybe it's closer to this end of the spectrum, but that pendulum has gone way too far in the opposite direction, and we need to bring that somewhere closer to reality. Because the fact of the matter is that in the last 4 years, the schedule has slipped from 2026 for 80 pits a year to 2030 for 80 pits a year, and I think most recently the new number is 2035 for 80 pits a year. And so we have to do something about the nuclear enterprise, because I would offer right now it's a mission failure. It's not enough to be doing stockpile stewardship. You have to be doing more. And so those are the three big buckets when it comes to our arsenal. The other big bucket is missile defense, and I am a full-throated supporter of the attempts to build the Golden Dome. I think the time is right to do it. I think this is a once-in-a-generation chance to build it. I think the technology is there from both the sensor perspective, but also from an interceptor perspective. I think the only way to do it right is to go to space. If you're actually going to be able to have a fighting chance at intercepting Russian and Chinese missiles. And I think that how the commercial sector has made space lift affordable now in a way that was not affordable 40 years ago is another reason why it's possible now. And I think we've got the chance to do it now. I think we have to get something in orbit before 2028. I think we've got to be IOC by 2028. And I'm happy to talk about why I think that's the case. The last thing I'll say about Golden Dome is it's not meant to be an impenetrable shield. It is meant to intercept a limited number, and I define limited as, I don't know, like 140 inbound threats that could be launched by China and Russia. And by that, I mean, there could be scenarios in which a dictator wants to put 6 or 10 or 12 nuclear warheads on the United States as a way to get us out of a fight or prevent us from going forward by demonstrating stake, thinking it's kind of like a baseball brushback pitch. This could get a lot worse for you. And I used a limited number of low yield weapons against militarily significant targets. I'm not city busting, but I'm showing you that I have the ability to put a real hurt on you. I want to deny them the ability to do that unless they go high order, unless they fire 150, 160 weapons at the United States. And in my mind, this is, so let's say Vladimir Putin says, I want to put 6 weapons on North America within kind of the parameters that I laid out, and his generals come in and say, Mr. President, we can do that, but we've got to fire 120 at the Americans, 130 at the Americans in order to get that effect that you want. I think he would say, not unreasonably, are you out of your mind? Like, if I do that, the Americans are going to unload an SSBN at me in response. There's no way. So I think Golden Dome is not an attempt, and I think it's kind of willfully misconstrued in some sectors of the nuclear policy community as this attempt to create an impenetrable shield. I don't think it is. I think it's actually meant to deny the adversaries a low escalation pathway attack. Um, and in that sense, it's good for the United States, but it's also good for allies in that um, by making the American homeland more secure, particularly from these low escalation pathway strikes, or say if North Korea or one day Iran decides to say, if you get into this conflict, you're putting your own homeland at risk. You don't want to do that. By denying them the ability to strike the American homeland, it gives an American president more freedom of action to respond how he or she deems fit. And so that's really what I think Golden Dome is also trying to do. So I know I've been talking for about 15 minutes and I want to get to the questions. And so I'm happy to address any of the questions that you have. So I guess, Peter, I turn it over to you and we go into Q&A.
Yeah, we can do that. But if we're only 20 minutes after the hour, if
Okay.
you wanted to continue if you had some other things you wanted to walk through, feel
Okay.
go ahead and do that, and for let's say 10 minutes, and then at the bottom of the hour we'll go to Q&A.
All right, that sounds good. So another thing that I think we have to do is we have to get the Nevada National Security Site ready to test. And I want to be very clear about this. I'm not advocating for nuclear testing. And I'm not an engineer. So if the engineers and the scientists say there's no technical reason to test, I believe them. I don't like if they say that's the case, even as we build new warheads, that's fine. I think that's right. But we could find ourselves in a scenario in which an adversary does some type of breathtaking nuclear action, whether it's an employment or a test or a battlefield use or you name it. President may decide to do any number of things. He or she may decide to call it quits and go home and cry uncle. President may decide to match them tit for tat and mimic the exact same action that they've done. But I think that there's a number of scenarios in which the president could say, I don't want to use nuclear weapons on the battlefield, but I want to demonstrate stake and credibility. And so I want to light one off at the Nevada test site. And right now, I think the response would be, well, it's going to take about 3 years to get the Nevada test site ready to go. So you can't do that. The president could be tempted to say, well, to hell with that. I'm just going to light one off in the open air. Now, a lawyer could say, well, Mr. President, Madam President, I know you want to do that, but we actually are prohibited from doing that due to the limited test ban treaty. So sorry. There are presidents that I could see that would then say, well, to hell with that. We're just going to withdraw from the limited test ban treaty and we're just going to detonate one in the open air. I don't want that to happen. And I don't want the United States to withdraw from the limited test ban treaty because I think there's validity there. But I think that those who say we should not be ready to test in relatively short order are running a not insignificant risk. It's a non-zero risk that in an attempt to constrain the options of a president, that you could set fire to kind of like the last remaining test ban moratorium that's actually on the books that's by and large adhered to. And so I'm somewhat concerned that we've let our ability to do rapid testing, and when I say testing, I mean with actual nuclear yield, ossified to the point that it could have very bad downstream consequences if we're not prepared. And so that's my view on testing. I'll say something else about the nuclear enterprise and why I said NSA is a mission failure. Why is it mission failure? I think it goes into three different buckets. The first one is an overzealous interpretation of the regs. I don't think that the environmental regs and the workplace safety regs are wrong or that bad, but I think that there's some overzealous interpretation of those regs that prevent work from happening. And the New Republic did a good piece on this um, back in, it's either New Republic or The Nation magazine did a really good piece on this back in October of 23, I believe, in which, there's these uh, electricians and electrical engineers sitting around in a break room day after day after day, um, who have really great security clearances, but they can't do work because of some GS13 saying, well, we've got to get this small issue fixed, or buildings that were designed for enormous amounts of heat and essentially can't be caught on fire, that have sat unused since the end of the Cold War, and are now being repurposed. A GS12, GS13 fire marshal is saying, well, you need to come up with a fire plan for this building that can't catch on fire before anyone can do work in there. And that's a 6-month process. And so I think part of this is an overzealous interpretation of regulations. The second piece of this is I don't see a lot of evidence that there is a sense of urgency within some of the workforce. And I don't necessarily blame them, actually. But my views, and this is in part perhaps colored by my time in government, is that your normal day-to-day government bureaucrat has a sense of process and schedule, and and that's not always defined by a sense of urgency. And so there may be people that are at the labs or at the Forstall building, who are good people and they're smart, but they don't have a sense of like that. There's a sense of urgency that they must be moving much faster. And that's in part derived from the third problem, which is I don't see that there's a lot of political leadership on this at all. In that, we haven't had a president go out and make a public statement about the importance of maintaining a strong and credible deterrence in a long, long time. We haven't had a Secretary of Energy do that. We haven't had an NSA administrator that does that. And so, absent political leadership, and this is really where at the end of the day I put the problem at, you're not going to get a change in culture, and you're not going to get a sense of strategic urgency. What you're going to have is a sense of strategic complacency. We can move fast. We can cut red tape. We can move with urgency, but we have to make the choice to do so. And so until we can get to this point of real political leadership that gives guidance to the workforce and instills in them a sense of mission beyond just stockpile stewardship, that actually gets to, we need to be moving fast, accept some amount of risk when it comes to environmental safety and workplace safety, I think we're going to continue to fall behind. And I think that puts us at a not insignificant amount of strategic risk, in that we may find ourselves in a crisis sooner rather than later with an adversary that has nuclear advantage over the United States in a theater of operation, whether you're in the Western Pacific or Europe, and they look across the board and say, well, for every nuclear weapon the Americans have, I've got 10 times the number of theater nuclear weapons. They're not going to want to get into this kind of fight with me. Or they say, well, I've got a modern arsenal that's only a few years old, and I've got dual capable land attack or anti-ship capabilities. And the Americans got nothing other than SSBNs out at sea. And those, with a very small exception, those are all high yield warheads. And so my concern is that the more time goes on, we're accepting greater and greater strategic risk. And I really do think that the chances of nuclear war, primarily limited theater nuclear war, is far higher than we think it is. And I think that until we get the nuclear enterprise problem fixed and you get NNSA out of a position of mission failure, things are going to get worse and worse.
Understood. Very good, Bob. We have a lot of questions. Let me walk you through some of them. One of our members of the audience says that Ukraine has used drones to attack the strategic air base at Engels, and yet the Russians, uh, who have rhetorically and in written policy said that is serious stuff, have not responded, as you know, with nuclear force. So the question is, how do you interpret that?
I think they're afraid of NATO getting involved, either in directly as co-belligerents at the conventional level, or um, or some type of, potentially the Americans may go high and right and use nuclear weapons in response. But I think primarily they're concerned about NATO getting directly involved as a co-belligerent if that happened. And like I think the Russians know that if the NATO decided to get into the fight conventionally as a co-belligerent, their air force will last about 72 hours or maybe a week, right? They would lose all their naval forces in short order. I mean, to be very honest, like in a conventional fight, NATO would clean their clocks. Now, Russia could then escalate to the nuclear level because of that 10-to-1 advantage, but then it becomes we're going to use these nuclear weapons unless you guys stay out. And so the goal for them is keep the Americans and the rest of NATO out of this fight, and eventually they'll win. But if they use nuclear weapons, that there's a high chance that NATO could become directly involved as a co-belligerent, and then everything becomes dicey for them in a way that's far riskier for them than it is today. And so they're not happy, they don't like it, but I don't see that there's been any evidence that like any Russian nuclear warheads were actually destroyed in those drone strikes. So it's a problem. They're annoyed, they don't like it, but I think that from their perspective, they're kind of like, I don't want to say happy with how things are going, but it's acceptable to them how things are going right now in Ukraine. And that would change dramatically if NATO became a co-belligerent.
Oh, okay. We have a question about Finland. I'll read it to you. How long would it take to deploy a B-61 base to Finland and get it operational? And the second part of his question is, couldn't we take the existing missile defense systems we have, whether the Israeli or our own, and integrate them into what would become Golden Dome?
Yeah. So for the Finland question, in the Cold War, we had nuclear capable fighter bombers just parked on a tarmac with airmen holding a rifle around the fighter bomber, making sure that no one approached it. So, to all this talk that you have to have weapon storage vaults of a certain degree in order before you can even think about moving weapons there. Well, that's not actually the case. Having an airman standing with a rifle in front of the fighter bomber, that's a short-term solution. But we can build weapon storage vaults in places like Poland and Finland. It wouldn't take that long. Again, you have to move with strategic urgency to get those things built, and then you've got a permanent home. And I think that it would be a stepwise process in which you build the vaults while you're training Polish and Finnish pilots. And you don't have to do that in the United States. You can do that in Germany or Belgium or Netherlands or wherever, to get them up to speed on how to do that mission while you're building those vaults. So, this could be done relatively quickly, defined as anywhere from 12 to 24 months.
Okay. I'm going to ask you three questions that I wrote in the chat function, and they're from the Carnegie Endowment had a conference earlier this week on one of the questions they asked in a panel was, is there such a thing as limited nuclear war? And they talked a little bit about escalate to win, but the gist of it was, is there such a thing as limited nuclear war? And they argued that no, it's going to escalate to Armageddon. That's number one. And related to that is the use of nuclear weapons manageable? Stephen Young from the Union of Concerned Scientists wrote recently that no, they're not, and we should jettison nuclear deterrence insofar as a retaliatory strategy. And the only option that makes sense is abolition. But as I wrote in my weekly report, what do you do in the meantime?
Yeah.
Yes, we're not going to abolition day after tomorrow. Now, the third issue that came up at the Carnegie thing was quite interesting, is conventional weapons were adequate to respond to limited nuclear strikes. So those are the three issues, Bob.
Yeah. So is limited nuclear war possible? I would say yes, and I think that actually the constraints are such that I think it is possible that you could have multiple exchanges if limited numbers of nuclear weapons go back and forth between two actors, that could be protracted. And I think that this view that many have is a Cold War, it's 1968 view, of which we've got like 6,000 nuclear weapons in Western Europe, and the Warsaw Pact has a commensurate number, and there's God, like 25,000 tanks faced off against one another, and you're in this cataclysmic clash with all these nuclear weapons going on, and you don't have reliable second strike capabilities. You got some, but the numbers are so great that you know that that who knows what's going to happen, and there was an incentive to strike first, if you got into a crisis. I don't think that's the case today. I think today, with the United States having a very secure second strike capability in the form of SSBNs, and flexible options when it comes to bombers, and so forth, that I think the inhibitions to the United States and another actor firing ICBMs at one another over the poles and so forth, I don't worry about that much in comparison to a limited theater nuclear war, because the inhibitions are so great and the security of the second strike options are so strong that I think that any time somebody tries to do a high order strike on the other's homeland, it's going to precipitate a damage limitation strike on the other's homeland. So I think it's possible. I think it's possible. I think it's far more likely than what you described that our friends at the Carnegie Endowment Conference discussed, that you could have multiple exchanges of limited nature, low yield, within a JOA, within a joint operating area, within a theater with low yield or variable yield weapons on military significant targets that have almost no impact on civilian population centers, that neither side knows how to get out of, but both sides are afraid of escalating to a strategic attack on the other's homeland for fear of the consequences. Because a damage limitation strike only works if you have high confidence in your ability to get a fairly high percentage of the adversary's strategic systems. And so, is it possible that, like, after first nuke use within a battlefield or second nuclear use within a battlefield, that it goes high order and you're in a strategic exchange? Yeah, it's possible. But I think it's actually very possible that you can have multiple rounds of exchanges within the theater. And so I think those folks who say that are whistling past the graveyard. So that's the first one. To this question of nuclear disarmament, any nuclear use ends us in global cataclysm. Like, I think that's just silly. I that's silly. I don't understand how people make that argument in good faith. And moreover, how do you get to disarmament? It's kind of like, okay, we're going to get to disarmament, and then over here, the world's disarmed of nuclear weapons. In here is a miracle of some kind. Like, no one's actually articulated how you get from here to there. And I'm sorry, but the TPNW does not actually articulate what that miracle is. I think the only way you get to that miracle is actually one world government. Like, but we're nowhere close to there. And so until you can figure out like how to establish a planetary wide Leviathan, which I'm not sure like that would be a good thing, like how we can actually get to disarmament. Um, so I'm sorry. And what was your third question?
It was, aren't conventional weapons adequate to deter the limited use of theater nuclear weapons?
You got to ask our adversaries that.
Exactly.
Right? I mean, that's not up to us. That's up to our adversaries. So you build the force that is meant to deter your adversaries from carrying out an attack. Maybe for some adversaries, yeah, maybe a bunch of JASMs and LRASMs and TLAMs, maybe that is adequate for them. But maybe there are other adversaries in which it's nowhere near adequate, right? And I would offer that our adversaries, from what I've seen, is they don't think conventional forces are adequate.
Exactly.
Because otherwise, why would they be building, why would China be building, again, theater range, land attack, variable yield, nuclear capable launchers that can hit our bases from Japan to Guam to northern Philippines?
Exactly.
Like, if China doesn't feel that way, I'm not sure we should take great comfort in the fact that we've got pretty good conventional capabilities.
Yeah, the next question also came up at Carnegie. I found interesting is that the panelists said the pits we have can last up to 100 years, so there's no need to build new ones. Now, they didn't go further than that. They didn't say, well, if what happens if something deteriorates and you check it and you go to the strat commander and he's told, we got a lot of these things that are deployed here that don't work, or we don't think they'll work. So how would you, Robert, is there a way you can technically give us an answer and
Yeah,
stay unclassified?
Sure. I mean, what I say is, and look, I don't have a security clearance anymore. I'm just a normal guy, but plutonium, that's an element that we invented within the last century, and so we don't have a great track record of understanding as to what happens to that element over time. There is no, there's no tracking of how that thing changes over time. We know what the half-life of plutonium is, but um, so that's thing one. And like I said, like, I advocate taking old W-80s out of the ready reserve stockpile and slapping them in cruise missiles and saying that's good enough. Will it produce the yield that W-80 was designed to produce? We don't know. Maybe it will, maybe it won't. Like, I'm fairly confident it will produce some kind of mushroom cloud. But I've talked to enough people that say, many people say, well, we've done the modeling simulation. We know exactly what that yield would be. Well, we've never tested warheads that are 3.5 decades old and seen what the effects are. So maybe they would work and give you the exact yield that you think it's going to produce, but maybe give you a very different yield. But fundamentally, if you're building new warheads, you want the pit that's designed, that is built for purpose to meet the military requirements of that new warhead that you're building. So if you're building a new warhead design, you want a pit that is built to purpose to go into that warhead. It may not be perfect to take a pit that was built for a warhead that was designed when Lyndon Johnson was president, right?
Yes.
And then put it into a warhead that was designed when Donald Trump or whomever was designed, and think that's going to get the same effect. You actually want to recast the pits so that they are fit for purpose for that warhead for which they've been designed.
Okay. One of our attendees made a point to me that pits can last 100 years is the theory, but it's not. There's no proof that is in fact the case.
Right.
Another one of our, I could answer this because I do it all the time, but I'll turn it over to you. He said, if you want to cut the federal budget deficit, what part of the defense budget would you cut in order to transfer the money over to what you recommend? Assuming that was what you had to do.
Yeah, I would do significant cuts to RDT&E. The 2024 budget had 143 billion all in for science and research and development, testing and evaluation. Procurement was 167 billion. That's damn near 1-to-1 ratio. During the Cold War, that ratio was 1-to-3. In that, for every $1 we spent on R&D, we spent $3 on procurement.
Exactly.
And I would offer that. Look, I want to see Columbia built. I want to see F-47 built. I want to see Raider built. By all means, but $100 billion per year is enough to build all that stuff. You can cut everything north of $100 billion for the next 5 years, shove it into procurement and into the nuclear enterprise, and that will solve a lot of problems. And then beyond that, I would be looking at, like, frankly, cutting Army end strength, in order to pay for not only a stronger deterrent, but also a stronger defense industrial base and a larger a larger Navy and Air Force.
I'm going to turn it over to Jim Petrosky, who is our president, and see if he has a question for Robert.
Thank you, Robert. I think that just based on the number of questions we have, this is a great subject and certainly an important one. Yeah, I really like your framing of the argument about Rocky Flats, because I think it is the endemic issue sort of throughout almost all of the nuclear stuff. Like, all this stuff happened in the past. So my question is this: I agree that we don't want to go back to that, although I will argue that if we need to, we're surviving, even though Rocky Flats was, had problems. But the reality is we built a deterrent. I would argue that with modern techniques, knowledge from the National Ignition Facility, Saturn, et cetera, that never existed in past for qualification and testing, that the previous problems can be overcome fairly quickly because we have knowledge of them. Do you agree with that? And if so, then what truly is the primary hindrance? Is it just a failure of leadership, a lack of sense of urgency? I'm trying to poke at the right spot, and you threw a bunch of these there. What's the number one?
I think there's a lot of truth in what you said, is that we've learned a lot from process improvements. When you look at how we handle logistics today, just as an example, what Amazon's done and Walmart's done, there are so many industrial process improvements today that simply did not exist 60, 70 years ago, that we probably could speed things up significantly in a safer way than they did in the 1950s and 1960s. They were doing all this stuff with slide rules, and today everyone walks around with middle schoolers walk around with supercomputers in their pockets. And I say this as the father of a 12-year-old. And so, like, there's so many things that we could do faster and quicker today that our grandfathers did not have 50, 60, 70 years ago. So I think there's a lot of truth there. I think it comes down to political leadership, right? Like, we saw how quickly we were able to transfer weapons to Ukraine when President Biden correctly made the decision to do so, right? Like that, there's the example. We're able to cut through enormous amounts of Defense Departments, Commerce Department, State Department, Treasury Department red tape to quickly transfer weapon systems from the United States to a non-treaty ally. So it's possible if the political leadership is there. And that's why I go back to me, that's the fundamental problem facing the nuclear enterprise, is a lack of political leadership.
Jim, go ahead.
Yeah. So, and then the question about political leadership, I know, we put a lot of faith in, we change presidents so often, where does that interim, the long-term come? Is that from, you think that comes from Congress? Where do we make that change? Because I think I think a lot of our folks are saying there's change to be made, but how do we make that? Obviously, the citizens vote, that's a big piece of this. I think it's part of what NIDS does. But, how else do we affect that change? So, because we all see that as an issue.
I think we need to scare the dickens out of some senior political officials. I actually think that, like the president, for one, and I think that there should be, House and SASC, Senate Armed Services Committee and House Armed Services Committee hearings on these issues, so that the members of Congress, who are great people, but there's not a lot of them that are elected to do military issues. They're elected for a number of reasons, whether they want to cut taxes or provide universal health care or better education or whatever's important to their own constituents. But really very few of them are ever elected because they want to make sure that we have a robust and credible nuclear deterrent. But I think if you made the argument to them for the stakes of the issues and how far we've fallen behind, I think a great number of them could say, oh my God, seriously? This is where we are? That's not good at all, right? And they would just kind of like a normal human reaction as an American to where we are today. And I think that could go a long way to create political consensus within the House and Senate, and then ideally help put some pressure on the president as well.
Okay, thank you, Bob. No, you're a wealth of knowledge. You have some great ideas. Peter, I'm going to turn it back to you. I have no further questions. If we haven't hit any, we'll let Kimberly come in and finish this off. I did look into Q&A piece. I don't know if anyone looked here because we didn't have this. I do have one that I would like to actually. I'm going to renege on my last comment. I have one more question I'm going to ask, and it comes from one of our listeners, Professor Larafie. Do you think the offshore balancing as an alternative extended deterrence could strengthen the deterrence? And that's something we've talked about before in this forum. I'd be interested in your comments.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's possible. I think it's possible. I mean, fundamentally, what you want to do is give the president as much optionality as possible so that he or she can make the best decision that's tailored for the crisis at hand. And we've kind of really put the handcuffs on the president by going down so far, not only in numbers, but in the diversity of the force itself, in that we've kind of left ourselves with, some large warheads or large bombs that can only be delivered on a relatively small number of platforms, which kind of channels the president into only a very specific and very small number of types of responses. And so by having the ability to pursue different deterrent strategies, and then if necessary, different warfighting strategies, that ultimately is meant to strengthen your ability to deter the adversary to begin with, I think that can go far to prevent the kind of outcome for which I'm deeply worried. And Peter, I realized that I skipped a question. You asked me about, are there like David Sling or things like that, Israeli missile defense components that could be part of American Golden Dome architecture? I think so. I mean, I really think that Golden Dome is meant to be have three layers. One is the space-based layer. One is the existing ground-based interceptors to include the next generation interceptors that are coming online. And then the underlayer that Rob Sufer has written about is the shorter range, more point defense system.
Right.
And that can include Patriot systems, Aegis afloat, Aegis ashore, and THAAD batteries as well. But I think there's a young lieutenant colonel out there, I think his name is Dave Phillips, and also Eli Glickman have written about the utility of short-range point defense systems around America's missile fields, and how that can go, that actually can go really far as an additional kind of micro layer that can help defend the silos, which would cause our adversaries to think hard about how many weapons they need to target the individual silos themselves. And so cheaper. I do think that I think there's an area for that.
Yeah, and it's cheaper than going mobile with respect to ICBMs. Let me try something on you. The CBO came out with another of its what I call ghost stories. At least they're not calling the near $900 billion over the next decade. They're not calling it just modernization. They said modernization and sustainment of what you now have, or operation, because you have both. You have the new systems coming in. Senator Hoeven put together some numbers last September in which he said if you take Columbia, B-21, Sentinel, and then take NC-3, which is fancy name for nuclear command and control, and then take the cruise missile that is going on the bomber, our B-52s, and add it all up, it's $20 billion. Okay, now, whether you call NNSA new stuff or refurbishing warheads or giving a life extension, we'd have to do that whether we build a modern system or not. We'd have to do it with what we have. My argument, I'd like your comment on this, is that it'll eventually change, but close to 60-65% of what we spend is to operate the current systems we now have, which are anywhere between 35 and 65 years old. I think I'm right on that, but I'd like to know because when people say we're spending gazillion dollars on modernization, actually 2/3 of that is if you did nothing. You just took care of what you got in the barn now.
No, that's right. I mean, like when you include modernization and sustainment, like your Minuteman III sustainment costs are going to go through the roof as that missile continues to age, just like your sustainment cost B2 would go through the roof if it was going to continue flying into the 2040s. And that's part of the reason why you replace older systems with new systems, is because it simply becomes cheaper to buy new stuff as what previously existed. So, like, that's why when your Toyota has 250,000 miles on it, it's cheaper to buy a new Toyota than to continue to put on a new transmission and a new engine and a new so on and so forth, is because the things just get so old over time. And so, like, we're going to continue to have, a dual capable aircraft, whether that's an F-16 or an F-35. And so the sustainment costs are baked in. Same with the B-52 or the B2/B-21. Those costs are baked in when it comes to sustainment. And moreover, what I'd say is, if I saw the CBO reports, like $954 billion over 10 years. Okay, but that's only like 7% of the total DoD budget over 10 years. Because we're going to get north of $1 trillion, according to President Trump and Secretary Hegseth, in the 2026 budget, which should drop like next month. If we're going to get north of $1 trillion, and then you're going to see continued growth, even if it's just pegged to inflation. Well, $954 billion over 10 or 11 fiscal years, depending on how you count, with growth, say, call it 3% budgetary growth, that's only 7% of the defense budget, which, as you point out, 2/3 of which you're going to have to be doing anyways through sustainment costs. And so I'm very happy that our friends in the arms control community are suddenly all fiscal conservatives. Apparently, I welcome that development. But like, I just like this is a non-story to me.
No, I hear you, but it'll be all over the news, as you know, because CBO, when they originally did their study way back to get $1 trillion over 30 years, the CBO operates under rules which, if a senator writes them a letter and says, here are the assumptions you make, do that study. And the assumptions that were made were to get us to $1 trillion over 30 years. As one general officer told me, who had 4 stars up here, he said, well, they got the headline they wanted.
Yeah, right.
So
yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, I'm going to turn it back over to Kimberly. It's 10:58, and I want to thank you, Robert. That was an extraordinary kind of around the globe kind of look at our nuclear enterprise, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kimberly if she has any final word about our next event that we're doing, which I believe is in May. But anyway, thank you, Robert. On behalf of NIDS, you did a great job.
No, thank you. I had a great time, so thanks for having me.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you so much, Robert Peters, for sharing your time and expertise with us today. And we really appreciate it. Thank you to our audience, of course, and thank you to Peter Huessy for bringing this important content to our attention and helping NIDS fulfill its mission, which is to advance peace, promote stability, and shape policy through applied research, education, and consulting. If you have someone that you know that might be interested in our programming, please share our offerings with your friends and colleagues so that we can reach more people. We know that together we can help spread the word about deterrence, and we hope you can join us on one of our upcoming events. Please reach out if you need anything, and we hope you have a peaceful day and weekend.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.